video, I'm going to walk you guys through how to build an awesome 4K gaming PC build for 2024 and beyond. Powered by my favourite 4K GPU right now, the RTX 4080 Super, this is a system that's ready to smash through all the latest titles at that top resolution. I'm also hoping, based on my other part selections, it's going to look pretty good in the process, be fairly easy to put together. See, this is just difficult. This doesn't need to be this difficult. And provide great performance, not just in gaming tasks, but other productivity applications too. Let's do this. The Corsair K65 Plus Wireless is a 75% mechanical gaming keyboard with hot swappable pre-lubed Corsair MLX red switches. You get two wireless connection modes with both Bluetooth and 2.4 GHz and up to 266 hours of battery life for non-stop gaming. Customizable RGB lighting, Corsair IQ support and a programmable rotary dial make this a compact keyboard that has it all. Perky RGB lighting, a sleek grey and silver design, 2 layers of sound dampening and screw-in stabilizers round off a keyboard with plenty of features. I'm going to kick things off by walking through all the parts that make this build possible, why I chose the parts I did, and even some alternative options to consider as well. I'm then going to assemble the system and see what challenges we encounter along the way. Oh no, that didn't sound good. Before looking at performance a little bit later. Now let's start, shall we, with the graphics card and also the CPU, the all-important CPU and GPU combo. Now graphics, as alluded to in the intro, is delivered by this RTX 4080 Super. Now amidst a weird pricing and availability situation on AMD's option, the 7900 XTX, and plainly better performance, especially in ray tracing and DLSS accelerated titles, the 4080 Super makes a lot of sense. I'd even go as far to say, and this is coming from someone who's been quite critical of much of the 40 series, that the 4080 Super is worth it over its AMD counterpart, even if it ends up costing you another $100 or even $150 more. Latest pricing and availability for everything today will be linked down below. At the more budget and mid-range of the spectrum, I think it's the straight rasterization performance that's the most important factor to consider. But move up the price brackets and things like ray tracing and DLSS 3.5 with frame gen make a lot of sense. This is not an Nvidia ad in any way, shape or form, but AMD is plainly quite far behind in those technologies. Now you do still get 16 gigs of video memory. That is less than on the AMD counterparts, but I find to be enough when it comes to 4K gaming. 20 gigs would be better, but here we are. The Super version of this card adds a little bit more performance over the base model 4080 and drops the price. So good work Nvidia in making this GPU that bit more competitive. Now this is aimed solely to be a gaming PC build, and that explains my CPU choice. Intel's Core i5 14600K. Now I like the 14600K. It's a much more powerful CPU than the name might suggest, especially when you consider the fact that it's got more cores and better clock speeds than its AMD Ryzen 5 counterpart. It's also going to cost you more money and is more akin to something like a Ryzen 7 7700. With this being a 4K oriented build, the GPU is more likely to be the bottleneck than the CPU. That means something like the i5 is going to work fine. In terms of alternatives you could consider, the Ryzen 7800X3D would be the next best bet. 8 of the fastest gaming CPU cores on the market right now, and the AM5 socket obviously has better upgrade paths too. I like the 14600K and even the 14700K as well, but I appreciate there might be a slightly split opinion. Let me know in the comments below what you'd go for in a build at this price point. And now as far as motherboards go, and the memory, which is now on the floor, this is the MSI Z790 Project Zero. Now Project Zero is MSI's reverse connector standard. Obviously you've got Asus BTF and GeekaWhat Project Stealth 2. Now what this does is moves all the connections on the motherboard to the rear. And I quite like how MSI have actually packaged this board. It feels really premium and very nice. And as far as motherboards go, this one's pretty good looking. Now rear I/O connectivity is pretty strong on the board, which I like. Obviously got our 2.5 gig Ethernet, 10 gigabit Type-C, and of course Wi-Fi 7. This is one of the new sort of refreshed Z790 designs with all of the connections on the rear of the board. Everything from your motherboard up here to your fans, CPU, SATA, you name it, everything is reversed. And the box really handily helps to protect those quite delicate connectors, which are obviously now on the rear. If I had one gripe about reverse connector motherboards, it's that I quite like having PSU extensions in a build, but I will say things like fan, front panel headers, USB 3 internal headers are a lot easier to install when the connections are on the rear. Nice aesthetic too, lots and lots of covered heatsink, which is good, but no toolless NVMe slots, so that would be good MSI to see in the future. Now as far as RAM or memory goes, this is a 32GB kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB DDR DDR5. We find this to be one of the most reliable memory kits on the market. It's on the QVL list for pretty much every motherboard you can imagine that supports DDR5, and with a nice fast 6200 MHz speed and low CAS latency, it fits the bill really nicely. Storage, obviously this is a high-end build, so on a high-end storage solution. The Samsung 990 Pro fits that criteria really well. Read and write speeds of about 7.5 gigabytes per second, and in our testing, which you can find linked in the card section now, this drive holds up to that on both the read and the write exactly as advertised. 2TB is plenty of space for your most commonly used games and applications, and if you want more storage beyond this, a cheaper, larger SSD drive would be my go-to as a second option. It doesn't really make sense to jump up to the 4TB drive as you end up spending so much money that you might as well get an additional 4TB drive for the same price. Cooling wise, I've gone MSI's E360, wanted to keep the whole MSI theme going for today's build, and a big thanks by the way to MSI for sending out all the bits I requested today. In our testing actually of more than 20 of the latest CPU coolers, this E360 stacks up really well, especially for the price. It beats out more expensive options from other brands in our CPU-Z and Cinebench runs, and of course gives you the RGB pump with 320mm RGB fans for good measure. It's a great place to save just a little bit of money and help keep a kind of a lid on the price of this build. I'm not going to say this is cheap, but it's not an unlimited budget either. As far as power goes, I've also picked up this Deepcool PX1000G. I'm not quite sure what happened to the box. Hopefully the power supply is fine. This is an ATX3 fully modular 80 plus gold unit. The ATX3 standard obviously gives us the new PCI Gen 5 power connector. That will be on show as the MSI GPUs don't yet support reverse power like you'll see on Asus cards. And ATX3 is also a big step up when it comes to efficiency and overall power supply design. More improvements than just that new 12-16 pin connector alone. It's Future James here. Sorry for interrupting. Since filming this video, I've become aware of some issues getting hold of basically any Deepcool products over in the States. As such, I'll link an alternative PSU recommendation below and some further reading if you'd like to learn more about the situation with Deepcool in America. Back to the build. And that pretty much wraps up all of the components for this build, apart from the case. So I'm gonna clear the table and start things off with the chassis. And this is the Pano 100L PZ. Now, on a recent trip over to Computex, I saw a few cases MSI have got on offer and actually really like the look of this one. Fish tank PC cases are everywhere now. I'll be honest with you, I find this dual chamber trend that we're in kind of strange. Not because I don't like dual chamber cases, I always have, but they're hardly new. I mean, the Corsair 280X from what, like 7 years ago, featured on the channel a number of times. And it's wild to me to see us almost go back in time with more and more dual chamber PC cases. One thing I like about this case though, is that the glass is not just a complete square. So this is at an angle, then there's the sort of angular piece in the middle, and then the main side panel itself. I think with this, the way it works is you take the top panel off, so we can take that one out, and of course the rear one off as well. I really like they've got these pop joints in the panels, which makes them so much easier to remove. Now, by the looks of things, this is in a vertical GPU mount configuration, though at the moment, I'm not sure if we have a riser cable. I'm guessing that that's what this is going to be. By the looks of things, this is actually movable and changeable as well. Aha, I am correct. In the box, you will actually find a standard PCI layout, which you can go ahead and pop into the rear of the case too. That's good to see. Plenty of other accessories, but no GPU riser cable. That's a bit disappointing. I was kind of hoping that if this was going to be vertical GPU mount, especially included in the box, that you would also get the riser cable too. So that's a little bit of a shame. MSI would like to see you look at that. I'm sure the inclusion of a riser cable wouldn't break the bank. Now, luckily for me, I do have a few on hand, so it's not going to be a problem, and we can go ahead and use a vertical installation for this system. Otherwise though, the case looks pretty nice. Side mounted, obviously radiator and fan options here, as well as at the top. This little bracket removes for, I guess, cable management purposes, and then below that, this is where you're going to mount any hard drives, and presumably behind this, the power supply as well. This is on a hinge too. They're all hinged. Everything's a door. That's quite nice. 2.5-inch SSD spots at the bottom, and the power supply is actually at the top of the case, giving us loads of cable management room. One thing they've done too is where the radiator and fan mount is on the side is recessed back a bit. That reclaims some of the wasted space in the back chamber. So as far as case design goes, MSI, I actually quite like it. And as far as build quality is concerned, it feels really good too. With the case stripped down, the next stage is to build up the motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the GPU, memory, SSD, all of that jazz into the board, and do some prep for the CPU cooler as well. I always find it makes so much more sense to do things like the backplate at this stage while everything's nice and easily accessible. It becomes a lot more difficult to get to once moved into the case. Just be really, really careful of those rear connections on the motherboard. I think actually what I'm going to do is remove this little sticky 3M tab, and that's going to hold the backplate into place. I normally only remove one of them just because we just need to hold it. It doesn't actually need to be a completely permanent fix in. Say if you ever wanted to take it off, it's going to be screwed in anyway. So putting both of those 3M things on is going to make removing this thing so difficult in the end. Next port of call is popping the motherboard in. Now, the advantage of an ATX case and an ATX board is that all the standoffs are in the right places. And of course, as a BTF compatible chassis, we've got all these nice little cutouts here that all of our connections are going to poke through. Now then, really carefully with this because we don't want to damage any of the connections on the back, especially the delicate pins. Next up, it's time to finish the cooler. Now, in terms of actually getting this thing installed, shouldn't be too difficult. I'm thinking, do I want to go for a top or a side-mounted installation? I reckon top, so the cooler's in exhaust. I have got some fans, again, in from MSI. These are their EZ120 ARGB. I think they're called Easy on the basis they click together, and they actually do look really quite nice. So I think I'm going to use those for the radiator instead at the top and the side, and maybe put the included fans that you get otherwise at the bottom for a little bit more airflow. Some extra fans never hurt, and the rail that they are installed upon is easily removable too. Radiator, as I say, is going to go at the top with those new fans, and the water block secures really easily on top of our i5 14600K. 14th gen chips do run hot, so this is going to help keep a lid on those temperatures. So that's all in. Fans at the bottom, fans at the top. Quite like how these connected together. A bit more complicated than others, but the aesthetic result is really quite nice. The only other thing to do is to put those fans on the side as well. And as you can see, I've got another 3 just to fill this void here and act as intake to bring fresh air into the system alongside the fans at the bottom. So lots of positive pressure inside of this build. As I say, a little bit more complicated to link together than other options, but not too difficult in the grand scheme of things. And they look quite nice. While I'm around the back of the case, I'm going to do the power supply next. Now you'll notice this thing is a bit of a crazy cable situation already. So I'm also going to try and tackle that while putting the power supply in. 1000 watts should be more than enough for this build, and the PX1000G is going to work really, really well. While cable management on these rear connect motherboards is easier, I would say it does become hard when you've got a dual chamber case with the power supply whereby it's spitting all the cables out exactly where all your rear connect ports are. You know, for example here, getting the USB 3 power cable in, it is possible, but it's, you know, you've got this cable management Velcro tie in the way of the USB-C port, and it's just not always that well thought through, especially considering this is an MSI Project Zero case and an MSI Project Zero motherboard. As I say, maybe I'm complaining about the small stuff, maybe I'm being a bit picky, but I think actually getting the cables neat and tidy in this thing is not as easy as it really could be. And when you add on to the fact that this is the hub for the daisy chainable fans with 2 SATA power cables, a 3-pin RGB, a 4-pin fan header, and a USB connection, that's like, it's a lot of cables, plus the hub, plus the harnesses. It's just a bit crazy. And with the power supply and all the cables finally in, it's time to install the GPU. Now, of course, this is a bit of a big boy, and I need to go ahead and grab myself that PCIe riser cable as well. As mentioned earlier, this is MSI Supreme 4080 Super, and it's a bit of a beauty. That is a bit of a monster, and hopefully, size-wise, tubes might need squishing in a bit. I think it's gonna fit without too many problems. The one good thing I will say as well about these PCI lane covers at the back is that with 2 thumb screws, I think the whole thing will pop out and we can actually slide the GPU in. I was gonna say through the slot, but I'm actually not convinced that with the top, no, that's not enough height clearance. So I'm going to have to install it in situ. However, I'm still going to pop this out for the purposes and the benefit of removing the screws at the top. So just need to check in terms of clearance, that's going to be, I think, A-OK. This is a 3 slot card, so 3 PCI lane covers to remove. Still got the challenge of screwing it back in once we're in the case. However, taking these out now is a little bit more simple. Pop that in, click, 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 click.
3 days later.
Then, in theory, get in there. And here is the problem I was alluding to earlier. Look, I've predicted this. I can't get my screwdriver in. I can just about get my screwdriver. See, this is just difficult. This doesn't need to be this difficult. I have found a super short screwdriver, and hopefully, despite the fact it's not magnetic and not particularly easy to use, it should solve this problem.
It didn't solve anything. I had to help James.
With a bit of a helping hand, it's going in. All that then remains is the comparatively simple job of securing into place the cable. I say simple while having the cable just so tangled, it's unbelievable. Oh no, that didn't sound good. And in theory now, we should have ourselves a PC that works. And there's only one way to actually find out. So I'm gonna plug this into the rear, front panel cables, all the power's in, power supply's on, power button's here. That's a good start. Things are spinning. RGB at the bottom, those fans on the side are flashing, GPU's lit up, water block seems fine too. This is all going very well. Nothing at the top yet though, which is odd. So it looks like maybe there's a problem with these top fans. I think I maybe had the cables in the wrong ports. Give me a few moments and I'll sort this out and rejoin you in just a few.
RTX 4080 Super.
Moving through into performance, and it's no surprise to see the 4080 Super stack up really well. For all of the benchmarking, we used MSI's 323 URX QD OLED. It's a high refresh rate, 4K monitor that is perfect for this build, and with that OLED panel looks pretty incredible. The first game we tested was Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3. 4K as standard, we think it's where the 4080 Super really feels at home. This system performed super well. High settings, DLSS on the quality preset, and the overall result was 140 FPS on average. In Starfield at 4K again, really solid results. 4K high settings this time around, and the build achieved 80 frames per second across our test. Starfield is not really particularly well optimized, and it is very hard to run. So this result, while perhaps not as high as one might like, is still really strong for a game that struggles to run on basically any system. Hogwarts Legacy was a slightly better picture of 4K high, DLSS on the quality preset, and the frame rate clocked in at 125 FPS on average. DLSS is obviously a massive advantage of Nvidia over AMD right now, and in games like Hogwarts that aren't super competitive by nature, it makes sense to have it enabled. Move through into Fortnite, testing at 1080p competitive settings here, and again, this build delivered 301 FPS on average at 1080p. More likely than not experiencing a CPU bottleneck here rather than a GPU one, but still 300 FPS is more than enough and satisfies the high refresh rate on this monitor too. Apex Legends at 4K performs super well. We're flying through the benchmarks today. 4K high, 205 FPS on average. At high settings, 4K, oh, it's absolutely bonkers. To wrap up our testing, we also tested out Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K as well. Here we tested at high with DLSS enabled, set to the quality preset, and with frame gen turned on. Cyberpunk is a game where things like ray tracing and DLSS make so much sense to enable, and it's still one of my favourite ray tracing compatible titles. Here at 4K high, the build achieved 111 FPS on average. Without frame gen, you're going to be dropping down to 50 or 60 frames, so you can see just how much difference it's making in Cyberpunk. If you enjoyed this build, want to buy anything mentioned today, there will be affiliate links for everything down below for latest pricing and availability. Thanks for watching, get subscribed to see more from me, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.